January 17, 1945. Off the coast of Lingayen Gulf, Philippine Islands. The rain fell like lead sheets from a sky the color of gunmetal. Visibility stretched no more than 300 yards across churning black water. Aboard the Japanese destroyer Hinoki, Lieutenant Commander Tokishi Yamamoto gripped the bridge railing as his vessel pitched violently, 30-degree rolls that sent unsecured equipment crashing across the deck. The storm had come from nowhere, a tropical fury that transformed the ocean into a landscape of moving mountains. Through the salt spray and driving rain, he could barely make out the silhouettes of his own escort group, grey ghosts disappearing and reappearing in the chaos. This weather, he thought, was a gift from the gods. No enemy could possibly engage in these conditions. The Americans, for all their vaunted technology, would be as blind as he was, perhaps more so, given their reliance on mechanical instruments over the intuition of experienced seamen. He was wrong. The thunder came first, not from the sky, but from the south. A sound that cut through the wind and rain with mechanical precision. Then the ocean erupted. 600-pound shells began falling in a pattern so precise, so mathematically perfect, that Yamamoto's mind struggled to process what his eyes were witnessing. The first salvo bracketed Hinoki 30 yards to port and starboard. The second salvo landed closer, 20 yards. The third salvo struck home. The destroyer's aft magazine detonated in a column of orange flame that briefly turned the storm-darkened sea into daylight. Yamamoto never saw the fourth salvo. But somewhere in the tempest, American sailors aboard destroyers he could not see were firing shells he could not track, guided by instruments he could not comprehend, killing men with a precision that seemed to mock the very concept of chance. This was not how naval warfare was supposed to function. This violated everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had taught about combat at sea. To understand the shock that reverberated through the Japanese command structure that morning, one must first understand what they believed about American naval capability. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized superior night fighting skills, better optics, superior torpedo technology, and the aggressive spirit of the imperial warrior. These advantages had proven decisive at battles like Savo Island, where Japanese forces had devastated an Allied cruiser force in darkness. The Americans, Japanese intelligence consistently reported, were mechanically proficient but tactically inflexible. They relied too heavily on their technology. They lacked the warrior spirit. They could not adapt to fluid combat situations. More critically, Japanese naval officers believed that certain conditions neutralized American technological advantages. Heavy weather was chief among these equalizers. In storms, rain squalls, or dense fog, radar became unreliable. Fire control systems lost accuracy. Visual targeting became impossible. Under such conditions, the engagement reduced to close-range knife fights where Japanese superiority in optics and crew training would prove decisive. This was not merely hopeful thinking, it was doctrine, taught at the Naval War College in Itajima, reinforced through training exercises, validated by early war victories. The American destroyer force approaching through that storm carried a different kind of confidence. Aboard USS Nicholas, USS O'Bannon, and USS Taylor, the crews had trained for exactly this scenario. They had practiced coordinated fire missions in zero visibility. They had rehearsed radar-controlled gunnery until the process became automatic. They had integrated their fire control systems with approaching technology that the Japanese did not know existed, the Mark 8 fire control radar, coupled with the Mark 1A computer, a mechanical marvel that could calculate firing solutions while accounting for ship motion, target motion, wind, and even the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation. The American crews expected to fight in the storm. The Japanese expected to hide in it. What happened in Lingayen Gulf was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a transformation in naval warfare that Japanese commanders struggled to comprehend until the war's final days. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, American destroyer squadrons demonstrated a capability that seemed to border on prescience. They engaged targets in complete darkness with first salvo hits. They maintained formation in zero visibility conditions. They coordinated multi-ship fire missions with a precision that suggested some form of telepathy. The technology behind this transformation had a designation: surface search and fire control radar, integrated with analog computing systems. But the Japanese understood neither the technology nor its implications. Captured American radar sets, examined by Japanese technicians, revealed incomprehensibly complex systems. The Americans had not simply added a detection device to their ships, they had redesigned their entire tactical doctrine around electronic sensing and automated calculation. Consider the mechanics of what occurred that morning off Lingayen Gulf. The American destroyers were operating in a sea state designated 4-7 on the Beaufort scale, near gale conditions with waves reaching 20 feet. Visual acquisition was impossible beyond 300 yards. Under these conditions, traditional naval gunnery required spotters to observe shell splashes and radio corrections to the gun crews, a process that typically required 6 to 8 salvos to achieve a hit on a maneuvering target. The American destroyers achieved bracketing, placing shells both short and long of the target, on their first salvo. They achieved hits on their third. This was not luck. This was not superior seamanship. This was mathematics, executed by machines that did not tire, did not panic, and did not lose accuracy in foul weather. The Mark 8 radar transmitted pulses at 3.2 centimeters, a wavelength that could penetrate rain and sea spray with minimal attenuation. The returning echoes provided range, bearing, and target motion with accuracy measured in yards and degrees. This data fed into the Mark 1A computer, a mechanical brain weighing 2,700 pounds, containing 290 precision gears, cams, and servos. The computer received inputs: own ship course and speed, target course and speed, wind velocity, barrel wear on the guns, powder temperature, even the density altitude of the air through which the shells would travel. It calculated a firing solution, not once, but continuously, updating 20 times per second as conditions changed. The gun crews never saw their target. They simply loaded shells into breeches and pulled lanyards when mechanical indicators told them the guns were on target. The entire engagement was conducted by men staring at instruments, trusting that the green traces on cathode ray tubes represented real ships, real steel, real enemy sailors who would die if the mathematics was correct. The mathematics was correct. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto survived the destruction of Hinoki. He spent 14 hours in the water before being recovered by a Japanese patrol boat. When he reported to his superiors, describing the impossible accuracy of American fire through the storm, his account was initially met with skepticism. Destroyers could not achieve that kind of precision in those conditions. He must have been confused, disoriented by trauma and hypothermia. Perhaps he had exaggerated the storm's severity, or underestimated visibility. But Yamamoto's account matched reports from other engagements. Throughout the Philippines campaign, Japanese forces encountered the same phenomenon. American ships engaging in conditions that should have rendered gunnery impossible, achieving accuracy that seemed to defy probability. At Surigao Strait in October 1944, American destroyers had launched coordinated torpedo attacks in complete darkness, their movements so precisely synchronized that the Japanese initially believed they were facing a much larger force. At Leyte Gulf, American destroyer escorts had engaged Japanese heavy cruisers in poor visibility, landing hits with a frequency that Japanese gunnery officers declared impossible based on pre-war doctrine. The psychological impact of this capability extended beyond tactical shock. It represented a fundamental undermining of Japanese naval philosophy. The Imperial Navy had built its identity around superior warrior spirit, night fighting prowess, and the belief that Japanese sailors, through superior training and dedication, could overcome material disadvantages. The reality that American ships could fight, and win, without their crews even seeing the enemy struck at the core of this identity. Japanese naval officers began referring to American ships as possessing demon eyes. Reports circulated of American vessels that could see through darkness, through fog, through the smoke of battle. Some sailors whispered that the Americans had made pacts with supernatural forces, trading their souls for technological power. These were not serious beliefs, but the metaphors revealed a deeper truth. Japanese forces confronted an enemy capability so far beyond their experience that it seemed to operate outside natural law. The reality was more prosaic, but no less devastating. The Americans had simply invested enormous resources into a technological approach to warfare while the Japanese had invested in human training and spirit. By 1945, the resource gap was insurmountable. The symbolic object that came to represent this technological dominance was not the radar set itself. Few Japanese sailors ever saw one intact, but rather the radio direction finder, a simpler cousin to radar that some Japanese ships possessed. These devices could detect American radio transmissions and provide approximate bearings. Japanese radar operators, trained on these primitive systems, could occasionally detect American radar emissions. They could hear the electronic chirp of American search radars sweeping the ocean. They could detect when American fire control radars locked onto their ships. And then, inevitably, the shells would arrive. This sound, the high-frequency chirp of American radar pulses translated into audio by Japanese receivers, became the herald of death. Some Japanese sailors claimed they could distinguish between different American radar types by their sound signature. The rapid chirp of surface search radar meant you had been detected. The slower, more powerful pulse of fire control radar meant you had been targeted. And if you heard both, simultaneously, from multiple bearings, it meant you were about to die in a coordinated attack from ships you could not see, firing shells you could not track, guided by a technology you could not match. Commander Tamechi Hara, one of Japan's most successful destroyer captains, described in his post-war memoirs the experience of being hunted by American destroyers equipped with radar. He wrote that the sensation was akin to being blind while fighting an opponent with perfect vision. Every maneuver was reactive, every decision made without information. American ships seemed to anticipate his movements, to know where he would be before he arrived. They fought, he wrote, as if they could see the future. They could not see the future. But they could see the present with a clarity that 3 years earlier would have been impossible. The Mark 8 radar could track multiple targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, more than 11 miles. In conditions of perfect visibility, a human observer might spot a destroyer at 8 miles. In rain, fog, or darkness, human vision was useless. Radar was constant. It did not blink, did not grow tired, did not mistake shadows for ships or clouds for smoke. It simply reported what was there, with mechanical indifference, and the computers calculated what to do about it. The transformation this capability wrought extended beyond individual engagements. It fundamentally altered American naval tactics. Pre-war doctrine emphasized daylight gunnery engagements where superior optics and crew training determined outcomes. By 1944, American destroyer squadrons actively sought night engagements and foul weather conditions, understanding that these environments maximized their technological advantage while neutralizing Japanese strengths. This was not merely adaptation, it was inversion. The Americans had transformed weather and darkness from obstacles into weapons. A storm that would have forced previous generations to seek harbor became an opportunity. Japanese forces, detecting an approaching typhoon, might breathe easier, believing the weather would ground American aircraft and render their ships safe. Instead, American destroyers would emerge from the storm like mechanical wraiths, their guns firing with uncanny precision, their torpedoes launched at targets the crews never saw with naked eyes. The industrial capacity behind this transformation was itself a form of warfare. Each destroyer equipped with modern radar and fire control represented thousands of tons of specialized electronic equipment, millions of man-hours of engineering, and a supply chain that stretched from MIT's radiation laboratory to the factory floors of General Electric and Westinghouse. The magnetrons that powered American radars required precision manufacturing tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The vacuum tubes in computing systems needed to operate reliably in conditions of violent ship motion, salt spray, and temperature extremes. The entire technological ecosystem required not merely wealth, but a deeply embedded culture of precision manufacturing and system integration. Japan possessed brilliant engineers and dedicated workers. What they lacked was the vast industrial infrastructure, the institutional knowledge, and the 3 years of intensive development that American forces had invested in radar technology. By the time Japanese technicians understood what they were facing, replicating it was beyond their capacity. The factories were being bombed. The rare materials were unavailable. The shipping to deliver components was being sunk by American submarines that also used radar to hunt in darkness and foul weather. The war became a demonstration that superior warrior spirit could not overcome a sufficiently large technological and industrial gap. This was the lesson that Japanese officers absorbed, bitter and complete, as their ships were shattered by enemies they never saw. After the war, American naval officers who interrogated captured Japanese commanders were struck by their counterparts' incomplete understanding of what they had faced. Many Japanese officers believed American radar was significantly less capable than it actually was, attributing American success to overwhelming numbers or luck. When shown the actual specifications of American fire control systems, the tracking accuracy, the update rates, the integrated computing, some refused to believe the numbers. Such capability seemed beyond what was technically possible. This disbelief reflected a broader failure of imagination. The Imperial Japanese Navy had pioneered carrier aviation, had developed the world's most effective aerial torpedo, had built the largest battleships ever commissioned. But they had not grasped that the future of naval warfare lay not in larger guns or faster ships, but in information dominance. The side that could see farther, calculate faster, and coordinate more effectively would win regardless of traditional factors like crew training or aggressive spirit. The Americans had grasped this truth, invested enormous resources into realizing it, and by 1945 had achieved a form of combat capability that seemed to operate in a different dimension than traditional naval warfare. They could fight in conditions where fighting should be impossible. They could hit targets that should be unhittable. They could coordinate fleet movements with a precision that appeared supernatural because it was mediated by technologies the enemy did not possess and could not counter. The storm off Lingayen Gulf that morning revealed this truth with brutal clarity. The rain that Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto believed would protect his vessel instead became irrelevant. The waves that should have made gunnery impossible were simply incorporated as variables in the American computer's calculations. The visibility that was reduced to hundreds of yards for human eyes meant nothing to radar pulses that reached across miles. The Japanese destroyers, hiding in weather, were never hidden at all. They were simply targets, illuminated on green glowing screens, converted to firing solutions, and destroyed by mathematics that cared nothing for courage or spirit or the warrior's way. In the final months of the war, as American forces closed on the Japanese home islands, the technological gap became a chasm. American destroyer squadrons patrolled the approaches to Japanese harbors with impunity, engaging coastal batteries and small craft with standoff precision. They bombarded industrial facilities in zero visibility, guided by radar mapping of coastlines. They intercepted Japanese supply convoys in darkness and obliterated them before the merchant captains understood they were under attack. Japanese sailors, when they survived these encounters, reported a distinctive quality to American naval gunnery: its mechanical relentlessness. Traditional naval engagements involved periods of intensity followed by lulls as ships maneuvered, damage was assessed, and new targeting solutions were calculated. American radar-directed fire did not pause. Once a target was acquired, shells arrived with metronomic regularity, the interval between salvos determined not by human decision but by the reload rate of automatic gun systems. Ships burned and sank under this mechanical drumbeat, pounded to scrap by an enemy that never tired, never lost track, never stopped calculating the next firing solution. The psychological toll of facing such an enemy was devastating. Japanese sailors who survived multiple engagements with American forces often reported symptoms consistent with what would later be termed combat fatigue or PTSD, hypervigilance, inability to sleep, panic responses to certain sounds. But the specific trigger was unique to the radar war. The sound of electronic chirping in headphones, the knowledge that you had been detected, that somewhere beyond the horizon or weather or darkness, computers were calculating how to kill you, and there was nothing you could do to prevent it. Some Japanese vessels resorted to desperate measures. They would maintain strict radio silence and shut down all electronic emissions, hoping to become invisible to American sensors. But American surface search radar did not require the target to emit anything. It detected the physical presence of steel hulls and superstructures. Silence was not stealth. Other vessels attempted radical maneuvers when they detected American radar locks, but the Mark 1A computers simply recalculated for the new course and speed, updating their solutions faster than human gunners could manually traverse their weapons. Evasion was futile. The most effective Japanese response was to not engage at all, to remain in port, to hide among islands, to move only in the worst weather and at the darkest hours of moonless nights. But this was not a tactical response. It was an admission of defeat. A navy that cannot sortie from its harbors has ceased to function as a fighting force. The recurring symbol that haunts accounts of these final engagements is light. Not the light of muzzle flashes or burning ships, but the cold, green glow of radar displays in darkened combat information centers. American sailors who served in these spaces described a strange reversal of traditional naval experience. Above decks, in the storm or darkness, nothing was visible. The world was reduced to wind, spray, and the mechanical vibration of turbines. But below decks, in the radar room, the battle was completely visible. Green traces moving across circular displays, range and bearing displayed with numerical precision, multiple targets tracked simultaneously. These sailors fought a war mediated entirely through electronic representation. They never saw the enemy ships they helped destroy. They never witnessed the results of their accuracy. They simply watched glowing dots move across screens, noted when dots disappeared, and updated their logs with dispassionate entries: target ceased to emit. Presumed sunk. Shifting fire to target bearing 270, range 14,000 yards. This antiseptic quality to modern warfare, the distance between the warrior and the human consequence of his actions, would become a defining characteristic of military technology's evolution. But in 1945, it was new, strange, and psychologically disorienting even for those who practiced it. American sailors sometimes reported feeling that they were not actually fighting, merely operating complex machines. The reality of war, the blood, the screaming, the dying, was happening somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond perception, rendered abstract by distance and technology. Japanese sailors experienced no such abstraction. They knew, with visceral immediacy, what it meant when shells arrived from nowhere. They felt the concussion in their bones, breathed the smoke, pulled their wounded shipmates from wreckage. For them, the war was physical, immediate, and terrifying precisely because its origin was invisible and unstoppable. This asymmetry, American sailors fighting through abstraction while Japanese sailors died in concrete horror, represented more than a technological gap. It represented a gulf in industrial capacity, in systematic R&D investment, in the ability to translate scientific knowledge into operational capability. The United States had not merely outproduced Japan in tonnage of steel or numbers of ships. It had created an entirely new paradigm of naval warfare and deployed it across the Pacific with devastating effectiveness. When Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto was finally repatriated after the war, He attended several conferences where captured American radar equipment was displayed for study by Japanese naval officers. He stood before a Mark 8 radar set, reading the translated technical specifications, trying to reconcile this mechanism with his experience in Lingayen Gulf. The numbers seemed impossible. 20-mile detection range. Accuracy to within 50 yards. Track while scan capability for multiple targets. Automatic data transmission to fire control computers. He asked the American technical advisor present how long it had taken to develop this system. The answer, a Manhattan Project-scale effort beginning in 1940, involving thousands of engineers, tens of millions of dollars in funding, and the complete redesign of fire control doctrine for the entire U.S. Navy. The Mark 8 was not a weapon system. It was the culmination of a parallel war, a war fought in laboratories and engineering departments, a war that Japan had lost before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor because they had not known that war was being waged. This realization, that the Pacific War had been decided not merely by bombs and bullets but by research budgets and engineering programs, profoundly affected Japanese military thinking in the post-war period. The lesson learned was not that spirit and courage were worthless, but that they were insufficient against an opponent who could field technologies that rendered traditional tactics obsolete. The warrior might be brave, the strategy brilliant, the execution flawless, but none of that mattered if the enemy could see in darkness, calculate in milliseconds, and strike with precision from beyond the range of retaliation. The storm off Lingayen Gulf had concealed nothing. It had merely revealed, with brutal clarity, the real nature of modern warfare. A contest not of warriors but of systems, not of courage but of capability, not of spirit but of technology married to industrial might. The rain that fell that morning had been just rain. The darkness was merely an absence of light. These natural conditions, which throughout history had provided concealment and protection, had been rendered irrelevant by human ingenuity applied to the problem of killing more effectively. In the decades after the war, the technological arms race that began with radar would accelerate beyond what even American engineers in 1945 could have imagined. Radar would evolve into phased arrays and synthetic aperture systems. Analog fire control computers would be replaced by digital processors millions of times more powerful. The green glowing cathode ray tubes would become high-resolution displays showing satellite imagery and data link information from platforms hundreds of miles away. The asymmetry that Japanese forces experienced in 1945 would become, if anything, more extreme as precision-guided munitions and networked warfare systems created an even larger gap between technologically advanced militaries and those without such capabilities. But the fundamental transformation occurred in those years between 1942 and 1945, when radar went from an experimental curiosity to a decisive weapon system. The Americans who developed and deployed this technology could not have known they were establishing a template that would dominate military affairs for the next 80 years. They were simply solving an immediate problem: how to fight effectively at night and in bad weather. The solution they developed, information dominance through sensor technology and automated computation, would prove to be more revolutionary than they understood. For the Japanese sailors who faced this revolution, the experience was one of profound disorientation. They had entered the war believing in certain truths about naval combat: that weather provided protection, that darkness favored the bold, that superior training and spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Every one of these truths was revealed to be false, not through defeat in fair combat, but through obsolescence. They were fighting a war for which they had prepared superbly, only to discover that the enemy was fighting an entirely different war, one for which preparation was impossible without access to the underlying technology. The final symbolic image from Lingayen Gulf was not captured by any camera, but exists in multiple eyewitness accounts from Japanese survivors. As Hinoki slipped beneath the waves, breaking apart as her boilers exploded, the storm began to clear. For a brief moment, the clouds parted and moonlight illuminated the scene. The survivors in the water could see, perhaps 3 miles distant, the silhouettes of American destroyers. They were in perfect formation, line ahead, their turrets trained outward in textbook defensive posture. They were neither fleeing nor celebrating. They had simply executed a fire mission, achieved the desired result, and moved on to their next objective. The survivors watched those silhouettes disappear into the darkness. None of the American ships altered course to search for survivors. This was not cruelty. The destroyers were proceeding to their next assigned position, and stopping would have made them vulnerable to submarine or air attack. But for the men in the water, there was something profoundly impersonal about the encounter. They had been destroyed not by a visible enemy in a comprehensible battle, but by mechanical processes they could not see, guided by technologies they did not understand, executed by sailors who never laid eyes on the men they killed. This impersonality, this reduction of naval combat to an engineering problem to be solved through superior information processing, was perhaps the most lasting legacy of the radar revolution. War had always been terrible, but it had been fundamentally human. Combatants saw each other, recognized each other's humanity even as they tried to kill each other. The new warfare was different. It was mediated through electronics and mathematics. The enemy was not a person but a data point, a set of coordinates, a trajectory to be calculated and countered. The killing was no less real, but it was abstracted, occurring at distances and under conditions where the fundamental human connection between combatants was severed. Some would argue this made war more humane, removing the passion and rage that produced atrocities. Others would argue it made war more terrible, stripping away the last constraints of human connection. But regardless of moral judgment, the transformation was irreversible. The storm off Lingayen Gulf was not the beginning of this transformation that had occurred years earlier, but it was a perfect distillation of what it meant. Nature itself had become irrelevant to war. The storm that should have made combat impossible was merely data to be processed, variables to be computed, factors to be incorporated into mathematical models that produced dead men with mechanical efficiency. Today, the waters off Lingayen Gulf are peaceful. Fishermen work the same seas where destroyers once dueled in darkness. The storms still come, tropical disturbances that render the ocean treacherous and reduce visibility to nothing. But the ships that now navigate these waters do so with GPS positioning accurate to within meters, with satellite weather data, with radar systems that make the Mark 8 seem like a crude toy. The technological revolution that began with those early radar sets has advanced so far that what seemed impossible in 1945 is now routine. But the lesson remains relevant. Technology does not make war obsolete. It changes the nature of war, shifts the basis on which outcomes are decided, and creates new asymmetries between those who possess advanced capabilities and those who do not. The Japanese officers who were stunned by American destroyers firing through storms with perfect accuracy were experiencing the same shock that has reverberated through military history whenever one side achieves decisive technological advantage. The longbow at Crécy, the rifle musket in the American Civil War, the machine gun on the Western Front, each represented a moment when traditional tactics suddenly became suicidal, when courage was insufficient, when the old ways of war were revealed to be obsolete. The radar revolution was another such moment, perhaps more profound than previous ones because it did not merely improve an existing capability but created an entirely new one: the ability to sense and target enemies regardless of weather, darkness, or concealment. In doing so, it established a template for modern warfare, where information dominance, the ability to see first, decide first, and act first, determines outcomes more surely than numbers, firepower, or tactical skill. The storm off Lingayen Gulf concealed nothing. Through wind and rain and darkness, American technology illuminated what it needed to destroy and destroyed it with mechanical precision. The Japanese officers who witnessed this capability understood, perhaps more clearly than their American counterparts, what it represented: not merely a new weapon, but a new form of war, one where nature provided no sanctuary, where darkness offered no protection, where the enemy could see you, target you, and kill you without ever acknowledging your existence as anything more than a coordinate on a radar screen. This is the legacy of that morning. The knowledge that in modern war, the storm is no longer shelter, the night is no longer shield, and courage alone is no longer enough. What matters is the quality of your sensors, the speed of your computers, and the sophistication of the systems that translate information into violence. The officers who learned this lesson off Lingayen Gulf paid for it with their ships, their crews, and their cherished beliefs about what war was supposed to be. Their successors in every military around the world have spent the subsequent decades learning the same lesson, refined and amplified by technologies that would seem like sorcery to those sailors who fought in the storm, but which follow the same inexorable logic. In war, the side that sees more clearly will kill more effectively, and all the courage in the world cannot overcome that fundamental asymmetry. The rain falls still, the storms still come, but they conceal nothing from those who possess eyes that can pierce darkness and calculations that render weather irrelevant. This is the truth purchased at Lingayen Gulf, written in the lives of men who drowned in a storm that betrayed them, killed by enemies they never saw, in a war that had already been decided by engineers and scientists they never knew existed.